Thank you, Senator Hassan, for your remarks and for sharing the importance of preventing government shutdowns. As an Okie born and raised, I am pleased to introduce our next guest. Senator James Lankford is currently serving in his second full term as senator from Oklahoma and previously served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. He is a member of the Senate Committees on Intelligence, Finance, and Homeland Security and Government Affairs, where he serves as the ranking member of the Government Operations and Border Management Subcommittee. Joining him to moderate a fireside chat on his current efforts to end government shutdowns is Jack Fitzpatrick, who covers Congress for Bloomberg Government, focusing on budget and appropriations process. Previously, he covered energy and environmental policy for Morning Consult and House campaigns for National Journal's Hotline. Thank you both for being here today. Jack, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm really excited to be here to moderate this discussion with Senator Lankford. It is a bit of an unfortunately relevant time to talk about shutdowns, so I'll get right to it. Senator, thank you so much for joining us here today, given that we've got 10 days left until the deadline to fund the government. I have to start with the most obvious question at hand. Do you expect a shutdown on October 1st?
I don't expect it, but it's always a possibility at this point. There's a lot of things that can be done in the next 10 days to be able to avoid that, and I hope we take one of those off ramps on it. But it is one of those things that just hangs over our economy, and quite frankly, everyone who's a federal worker, their family, it just hangs over them right now.
What do you make of what's happening in the House right now? And I ask because it does seem that senators are sort of waiting on action from the House. The last we heard was a proposal to tie to a stopgap measure 8% cuts to non-defense programs and a series of immigration measures. Does that sound like an appropriate solution at this point to you?
I think there'll be lots of different options that are coming out there. I think there's some folks in the House that are not only worried about just where we are with $33 trillion in debt, which is a very real issue. They're also worried about immigration enforcement and trying to figure out how to be able to do that. We'll see what the final policy proposal is there. There's some things that can be done on the border, obviously, to be able to help. It seems odd to have it in this type of format to be able to do it, but there is wide bipartisan sense that there are problems when we have 6 million people that have crossed our border without prior authorization coming across our border just in the last 3 years. So that is a big issue. Obviously, our $33 trillion in debt is a big issue. Trying to be able to slam those together to be able to resolve in the next 10 days gets harder, but let's at least talk about all the different issues.
Do you foresee a point at which the Senate has to step in, given the unsuccessful attempts in the House to bring up that CR, a failed procedural vote on a defense appropriations rule in the House? Do you think the Senate needs to take a more aggressive stance in getting things moving?
Right. First things first, the House has got to be able to act. If they cannot act, the Senate has to be able to act on it. Interestingly enough, I had a conversation with another member just yesterday. We're talking about government shutdowns and House and the Senate and how this operates. If I go back just in the past 10 years or so, almost all of the shutdowns actually originated from the House. There's one that actually originated in 2018 that actually came from the Senate side, shutting down the government, but most of them actually originate in the House of whatever party is there. And so this conversation about what's the House going to do is a pretty common conversation wrapped around a shutdown. So that's why this has to be a bicameral, bipartisan solution for how we're going to actually end shutdowns forever and actually keep us debating the issues that we need to debate without actually holding federal workers and all the American people hostage in the process.
Well, so we can put this into a better context for the viewers and listeners who are watching on YouTube right now. I'm sure we'll get into the things that average everyday Americans see in terms of the effect of a shutdown, like national parks closing. But I'm curious, from a senator's perspective, what are your top concerns about what happens during a shutdown?
Well, obviously, national parks is one of those issues, but that's not by far the biggest issue on this. First thing that happens is federal workers are not getting a paycheck. And many people will say, well, they will be paid in back pay. But if it's like the last shutdown that lasted, I think, 34 days, they're missing several paydays in that process. A lot of Americans still live paycheck to paycheck. And to be able to say, we'll pay you eventually is not adequate. So just the trauma that does on federal workers. And then if I take the next step, we want to hire great people to be able to work and serve their neighbors in the federal government. it's harder to hire someone if we say to them, hey, every once in a while, we may not pay you. Is that okay? For most people, that's not okay for them and for their families. So it makes it harder to hire. It makes it harder to be able to supervise and very stressful on those families. Second thing is it causes just a contagion of issues, whether it be FAA and then setting aside what's happening in training future air traffic controllers. That's a big issue. The reason that occurs is because we may pay federal workers, but federal contractors, now they don't get back paid. They're just not paid. So we've got contractors in all levels of the federal government. Take air traffic controllers and some of that training that's happening there. We just can't function without it. That puts us behind for years in training air traffic controllers. If you go to the southern border right now, where we have millions of people that have crossed in the last 3 years, just this week, we had 7,000 people a day that were illegally crossing our border. Well, the Border Patrol, it's overwhelming them. So they have contractors that work alongside them that help with transportation, help with the processing, help with getting food and all those things to be able to assist those individuals with humanitarian needs. We have a shutdown. Those contractors are off. That adds a tremendous additional workload to folks that are already overwhelmed on our border. That affects our national security. So everywhere you turn when there's a shutdown, it's not only the chaos that forms in every agency of who's essential, who's non-essential, the chaos in every family, but for a lot of those contractors and some basic functions of government, it just doesn't happen, whether it be national security or whether it be preparation for the future. These are all really big issues. So a shutdown is not an event that just occurs and it has no damage. It has long-term damage.
Do you want to see any kind of change in the approach to contractors? I know after the last shutdown, there's a measure enacted that guarantees back pay for federal employees, and that previously was kind of up to Congress. Should there be a different approach? Should there be back pay for contractors, or any difference in how Congress addresses that?
Yeah, we should address about not having shutdowns. That's the best way to be able to address that. If you're talking about how to chase down contractors who were there and not there, some of them are on call, some of them are salary, some of them are, well, all of them are outside entities. That's very hard to be able to track and to be able to measure. That increases the cost of the federal government again into the taxpayer when you're trying to chase that down after the fact to be able to do that paperwork. So why don't we just not have shutdowns? That'd probably be the best way to be able to do it.
Well, then let's talk about your bill that you've introduced a few times now, most recently in this Congress in January, to prevent shutdowns. I'm sure you can explain it better, but my understanding for those who are not familiar is that this would impose an automatic continuing resolution if we were up to that shutdown deadline. But then there are a series of measures to essentially make sure that Congress doesn't just work on other things, doesn't leave town. Do you have a plan to get that packaged with something? What's the plan for actually having that passed and enacted?
Yeah, so let me take both those questions. Let me kind of outline what the bill is and what it's not. There have been different bills for years on how to end government shutdowns, but they've been partisan bills. They've been automatic cuts or automatic increases or the no budget, no pay that's been out there. There's been all these different bills to try to prevent government shutdowns. There's not been a nonpartisan one. So 5 years ago, Maggie Hassan and I sat down and said, we've got to be able to solve this. Let's work together. Let's figure out what's a nonpartisan solution. The one pressure point in Congress that's the great equalizer for everyone is time. We're all extremely busy, as all the folks that are also listening in are all extremely busy as well. We all have busy schedules and a lot of travel, both with family and official business or campaign business, whatever it may be. So our idea is pretty simple. If you don't finish your classwork during class, you have to stay after class and finish it. I say that to say, if we go all the way through the fiscal year and it's not done with the appropriations, then that means automatically a short-term continuing resolution kicks in to be able to keep government operating and functioning at the same level as the previous year. But members of Congress and our staff, the Office of Management and Budget staff, they can't travel. We're all there all the time to be able to do it. In Congress, House and Senate, we're in session 7 days a week. We can't have any travel expenses to be able to travel somewhere else. And we have what's called a quorum call every day to be able to confirm that we're all here. Also, the only bills that we can move to during that time period are appropriation bills. So you can't move to other legislation. We're in 7 days a week, and the only thing that we can work on is actually appropriations. That locks us in to be able to say, let's finish that appropriation work now. And then once that is finished, then we can actually kick in where we're not in session 7 days a week. We can actually get back to travel. If you want to put pressure on members of Congress, take away time. If you want to see that effect on it, come to the Senate sometime at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. And if we're still here at that time, everyone's frustrated saying, I've got campaign events, family events, I've got a CODEL, I've got official travel that I've got to get done. And everyone's knows their schedule's getting blown up for the other travel that they've got to do. If we locked in and said, no one's traveling until we finish this work on appropriations, there'd be pressure on Congress to finish our work on time and to be able to get it done. And if we weren't done, I think that continuing resolution would be very short, because if we were here even 2 weeks in a row over 2 weekends of that travel, this place would freak out and would say, we've got to get finished on this because all the other responsibilities I've got to do are not getting done because we didn't get this done on time. So put the pressure where the pressure needs to be on members of Congress, the Office of Management and Budget, all of our staff to be able to get that work done. If we can do that, I think that's more effective in trying to be able to accomplish the work that we need to get done. Again, it's not trying to be gimmicky. It's just saying, if you haven't got your work finished, you got to stay until this gets finished, and you can't move to something else until it's done.
Your colleague, Ron Johnson, told me yesterday that he stood up at this Senate Republican conference lunch and said that he would relinquish his hold. He effectively delayed, when there was a unanimous consent request to hold this vote on an appropriations package. He said he would allow for more speedy consideration of that if he can be promised a vote on a bill to prevent shutdowns. Are you making any similar offers to make sure that there is a vote on this kind of bill?
Yeah, we're not trying to be able to pressure this. Something Maggie Hassan and I worked together on to say this is a nonpartisan bill. It wants to be nonpartisan the entire way on it. But Ron Johnson, who is obviously holding up appropriations at this point in that unanimous consent request to be able to move to it, someone literally said to him during our lunch, hey, if we're able to move on government shutdowns, which has been a bill, he's been very outspoken and supportive of my bill for years now. When he was chairman of that committee, we moved it through the committee unanimously. This has been a nonpartisan bill from the beginning, but Ron's statement has been, hey, we've got to start fixing some things here in Congress. And if he has the opportunity, he said, to be able to have something else that's fixed in this process, like fixing this government shutdown mess every year, he would take that and to say, I'm glad to be able to move that. Maggie Hess and I, we've actually put this forward. We're hoping that it can be an amendment into the appropriations conversation that we have right now to be able to get a vote on this. Again, just to be able to take the next step forward. Obviously, if we pass it in this appropriations work that we're doing this week and next week, it doesn't become law right away. It becomes part of that dialogue. Then it's passed the Senate. It has to go to the House and still pass the House in that format or in a different format for them. But at least we're moving on it. This has been something for 5 years. We've tried to find the right vehicle, right time to be able to move it. And after the shutdown is over, everyone says, yeah, that's really a good bill. I'm supportive of it. We'll work on that later. And then when we get close to a shutdown, everybody starts turning around and going, where's that bill that Lankford and Hassan have? Let's pull that forward and try to be able to get that done. So we're at another one of those moments. And I think one of these pressure point moments like this is a time when we've got the whole country talking about it to say, let's go ahead and vote on it. Let's actually get it up. Let's have both sides actually set out there and say, let's stop doing government shutdowns, but let's actually keep the work going on for appropriations. And so we can get those bills done, because none of us like CRs. They're not as bad as a shutdown, but they're not as good as getting appropriation work done.
When are you offering that amendment? Is that something you want on this 3-bill package, or what's the plan there?
It is actually. We've actually filed it for the 3-bill package. We've had it filed actually from the very beginning when this 3-bill package came up as a minibus here. We filed it during that time period. It's been sitting out there pending at this point. We're asking for it to go what's called through the hotline, where we have to have unanimous consent of everyone say, yes, I'll allow a vote on that. And then if it takes that point to be able to we can get consent among both sides to be able to get that vote, it would come up in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. If I could, before I know we only have a couple minutes left, if I could play devil's advocate on your bill, would a measure that avoids shutdowns and gives us an automatic CR, even with those restrictions that don't allow Congress to work on other things, would that paper over some more fundamental shortcomings with Congress? Is there something more fundamental about Congress's inability to do appropriations bills there?
Yeah, so this has been an issue for a long time. This goes all the way back to the 1974 Budget Act. You track these issues for a long time. The 1974 Budget Act, creating this new process, it's only worked as written 4 times since it was written in 1974. The process itself is very broken. In the Senate, Sheldon Whitehouse, who leads the budget committee as chairman, he's been very outspoken on this, that we've got to make major changes in the process of how we do budgeting. If we don't change our process, we're not going to get a better product. So that's a significant shift that has to be done. This is one of those elements to change the way we do budgeting and the way we do work, but we do have to change our process significantly.
And very briefly before you go, I should ask, a lot of the fight in the House and Senate on funding the government has cast an eye back on the debt limit bill. Do you feel that there are accusations that the House is going under the caps in the debt limit deal, and maybe that's not in good faith? The Senate has some emergency funds. Do you feel that everybody's still operating under the debt limit deal, or are lawmakers moving away from that?
I think the debt limit deal is still sitting out there as a number that everyone kind of knows is the agreed upon number. The House wants to go above it. The Senate wants to go beyond it. I'm sorry, the House wants to go below it. The Senate wants to go beyond it. But everyone still knows that's the agreed upon number on that we've got to be able to work towards. Again, it goes back to the most basic thing. With $33 trillion in total debt, we have to have grown-up conversations to be able to resolve this. And there's multiple different ways to do this. We can set up commissions to be able to talk through our trust funds and through what we're doing in all of our spending to make sure we're getting bipartisan, bicameral, real conversations about some of the issues. We can talk about discretionary spending and appropriation bills. There are ways to be able to address this, but we've got to get a holistic look to say, how do we get back on balance? If I go back to the late 90s, we were doing balanced budget work during that time period. Now, 25 years later, we're not close anymore. We're $2 trillion in the red in a single year. That's more than we were spending in the late 90s total. We're doing in deficit numbers 25 years later. So it is time for a grown-up conversation, but it can't happen all at once, and it can't happen in a moment like this. It has to be a moment where people have time to be able to think, process, plan, and to be able to look at the big picture.
All right, Senator Lankford, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through all of these issues. Clearly a very timely conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time.
You bet. Glad to do it. Glad for people's engagement on this. This is not intended to be partisan, and it's not intended to do anything other than say, let's protect us from shutdowns. It doesn't have any other trick features. It just takes that off the table.
All right. Thank you again.